There is something deeply unsettling about an old man destroying his own life's work, not by accident, not out of rage, but deliberately, methodically, 6 days before he dies. In February of 1564, Michelangelo Buonarroti was 88 years old. His eyesight was failing, his hands trembled, and yet by every account we have, he was still working, still standing in front of a block of marble, still carving. The sculpture was called the Pietà Rondanini, a grouping of two figures, the Virgin Mary and the dead body of Christ, locked together in an embrace that was never meant to be finished. I want you to understand what this man had already accomplished before he picked up that chisel for the last time. He had carved the David at 26. He had painted the Sistine Chapel ceiling at 37. He had designed the dome of St. Peter's Basilica, the greatest sculptor, painter, and architect Europe had ever produced. And in the final days of his life, he chose to spend them attacking his own marble. But here is the part that no one can fully explain. The sculpture Michelangelo was destroying in those last days was not a failure. It was not a discarded draft. What he was systematically removing was a finished, polished, technically accomplished version of Christ's figure that he had already completed. A version art historians can still partially reconstruct from the arm that survives, detached and hanging at the side, because Michelangelo never got around to cutting it free. That arm is smooth, finished, beautiful, everything the rest of the sculpture is not. And that contrast is the entire story. If this is the kind of content that makes you stop and look more carefully at the world, subscribe to Carrara. We explore what art is hiding beneath the surface. The evidence of what Michelangelo removed is not speculation. It is written into the stone itself. Art historians who have studied the Rondanini Pietà in detail, most extensively Alessandro Paronci and later Carlo Bertelli, have established a clear sequence of events. At some point between the 1550s and the final days of his life, Michelangelo cut away the entire chest and head of the first Christ figure he had carved. The torso that exists today is narrower, more elongated, almost incorporeal. The face of Christ, what remains of it, appears to be fusing with the face of the Virgin above him. The boundary between the two bodies is dissolving, and no one agrees on whether that was the intended destination all along, or whether it was the desperate improvisation of a man who knew he was running out of time. What we know is this: the earlier version was better. By every technical standard of Renaissance sculpture, the finished Christ that Michelangelo destroyed was superior to what he left behind. Smoother, more anatomically precise, more in line with everything the Renaissance valued. When Michelangelo attacked it, he wasn't improving it. He was moving towards something the Renaissance had no vocabulary for, something that looked, to the eyes of 1564, like failure, and something that looks, to the eyes now, like the birth of a completely different way of understanding what sculpture could be. The question that has no answer is simple. What was he trying to reach? There is a reading of what Michelangelo was doing that has nothing to do with aesthetics. Michelangelo was a man of deep, obsessive Catholic faith. His poetry, and he wrote hundreds of sonnets, returns again and again to a single terror: that his devotion to art was a form of idolatry, that he had spent his life worshipping beauty instead of God, that the sculptor's tools were a form of vanity. In his final years, he wrote this in a sonnet: "The fantasies that once seemed right have now been revealed for what they are. Two passions still alive in me, and one is closing in. One was art, the other was salvation, and in the end, he could not hold both." When you look at what the Rondanini became under his final chisel, bodies dissolving, faces merging, form giving way to formlessness. You are not looking at a technical experiment. You may be looking at an act of theological self-correction. A man who spent 60 years turning stone into flesh, and who in the end turned flesh back into stone, deliberately, systematically, as if undoing the very act of creation that had made him famous. Art historian Leo Steinberg, writing in 1968, called the Rondanini Pietà a work of deliberate archaism, a voluntary return to a pre-Renaissance visual language in which figures flatten and merge and resist the illusion of life. Steinberg believed Michelangelo was not failing to complete the Renaissance. He was rejecting it. That is a very different thing. On February 12, 1564, Michelangelo's biographer, Giorgio Vasari, noted that the master had spent the entire day on his feet, working. 6 days later, he was dead. We know from his assistant, Antonio del Francesi, that in those final days, Michelangelo worked without stopping until physical exhaustion forced him to sit. We know from a letter written by Daniele da Volterra that he was carving right up to the moment he became too ill to stand, and we know from the sculpture itself that he was not finishing it. He was not rounding off edges or polishing surfaces or preparing it for display. He was still cutting deep, still removing material, still going further into the stone in a direction no one around him understood. The Rondanini was never completed. It could not be completed. Not because Michelangelo ran out of time, though he did, but because what he was making had passed the point where completion was a meaningful concept. The sculpture had become something else entirely. Not a pietà in the traditional sense, not a finished object, something closer to a question asked in stone and deliberately left without an answer. After his death, his heirs were uncertain what to do with it. It passed through several collections, spent decades in obscurity, and eventually came to rest in the Castello Sforzesco in Milan, where it sits today in a room designed specifically around it. The room is dark. The sculpture is lit from above. You walk in and it stops you. Not because it is beautiful, because it is unresolved. And that is exactly what Michelangelo intended. If you want to keep exploring what the greatest artists in history were really doing beneath the surface, beneath the story, hit subscribe. There is a great deal more to find. I have been thinking about why this sculpture is so difficult to leave. You can read about it. You can look at photographs. And then you walk into that room in Milan and everything you thought you understood shifts slightly. Because the Rondanini is not the kind of art that asks you to admire it. It asks you something instead. And the question is not what Michelangelo was making. The question is what he was willing to unmake. He destroyed something that was, by the standards of his own world, superior to what he left behind. He chose incompleteness over excellence. He chose whatever was at the end of that new direction over the safety of the finished thing he already had. At 88, 6 days from death, he was still moving towards something he had not yet reached. There is a detail in the Rondanini that I keep returning to. The two figures, Mary and Christ, share a single neck. Not metaphorically, physically. The stone connecting their two heads is one continuous piece of marble. They cannot be separated. They were carved to be inseparable. And that means that what Michelangelo was making in his last days was not a pietà in the traditional sense, a mother holding a dead son. It was something that had no name yet. Two people so fully absorbed in shared suffering that the boundary between them no longer existed in the material world. Whether that is theology or grief or the exhaustion of a man too old to care about categories anymore, I cannot tell you. Michelangelo left no note, no explanation, only the chisel marks going deeper into the stone. And the question of what he was looking for that was worth destroying everything he had already found, that question is still open. And I think that is exactly how he meant to leave it.